Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Here it's about 1 in the morning, but it's all good to speak to you wherever you may be. My name is Arl Lamel. I'm a senior analyst with CSA Research. And as mentioned, I'm going to be talking about some of the lessons learned from China moving into the post-pandemic future. Just very briefly, for those who don't know CSA Research, we're a primary market research firm that focuses on the language industry, working with buyers of language services, LSPs, freelance linguists, technology vendors, and global buyers of localized products and services. Over the last year, as part of our commitment to the industry, we've conducted I think it's about 12 pro bono surveys that focus on the effects of COVID-19 on the language industry. And very early on, we knew we wanted to conduct surveys on China, learn what was going on there, and I'll be talking about the results of some of these surveys and as they compare to our international surveys. So as a bit of background, I'll talk about what we did with Chinese LSPs, and then I'll get into the results, which really show us that China anticipated very early on an optimistic outcome that wasn't at all evident in the rest of the world, but has since been proven to be very prescient. And we'll see that some of the ways that Chinese LSPs responded have been useful in charting the course for the pandemic and the recovery elsewhere. So why did we conduct a survey of Chinese LSPs? Really, the emphasis was that China had to deal with the pandemic conditions earlier on and dealt with restrictions before companies elsewhere did. And so as a result, they learned lessons that were of value early on, and we're able to see where the rest of the world is heading by looking at where China is today. So we conducted 2 surveys specifically with Chinese LSPs, as well as bringing in Chinese LSPs through our other broader surveys. We conducted one in April 2020 with 137 responses, and another one in August 2020 with 115 responses. And we got very good information from each of these. Now, the purpose of these was to learn about the experiences of the first movers in the post-COVID environment. In order to conduct this, we knew we had to carry out the surveys in Chinese, so we worked closely with the Institute of Language Services at the Hebei Normal University for Nationalities. Now, one question that came up early on, it's not been of interest so much lately, was whether we could talk about the specificities of different groups. And we found that 17% of our responses were interpreting centric. I'm not going to go into great detail about them in today's presentation, other than to say that they had a much more difficult time in responding to the pandemic for obvious reasons. They've also rebounded in some ways more quickly than others did, though. But the other question we got a lot was whether we could say anything about the specificity in Hubei province, Wuhan, where the early epicenter of the pandemic. Unfortunately, we only got 2 responses from that province, so we're unable to say anything specific about how it experienced it versus others. Now, one of the questions that we have to ask when we do these surveys are the Chinese companies representative of what we'd expect to see overall? So we asked several demographic questions to try and see how they compared to international LSPs. And what we found was that they actually were quite similar in the characteristics we surveyed. And from this, we concluded that they were actually representative of LSPs in general, and that we could probably generalize their responses for other areas. Obviously, setting aside that China has its own specific work conditions and business environment. Okay. And the experience shows how LSPs are emerging on the other side of COVID-19. Now, there was one area where the Chinese LSPs didn't exactly weren't exactly representative, but we found this actually to be useful, and that's that the Chinese LSPs were more focused on domestic clients than were LSPs elsewhere. So you can see that the Chinese LSPs, only about a quarter were focused on international clients, versus when we looked at top LSPs elsewhere, it was a little bit bigger proportion, 36%. But this was actually useful to us in that it meant that they were more situated and better positioned to understand how post-COVID conditions were affecting their clientele. Now, in reviewing the results from China, we had several points of comparison, just to give you some background. And I'll mention all the surveys that I'm discussing. The results are available free of charge on our site. So if you're interested, you can go look at these results. Most relevant are 4 surveys we've conducted with the CEOs of what we call our ranked 193. These are LSPs that rank in CSA's top 100 and global top LSP lists. And as you can see, we've had consistently a little over 100 of them responded to these surveys, and that was with the CEOs. We also conducted surveys with freelance linguists in May and August that garnered a lot of responses to understanding how they were experiencing the pandemic. I won't discuss those surveys so much here, but they gave us a lot of insight. Now, we also conducted surveys with enterprises and technology developers, but they don't factor into this particular presentation. So with that as background, I want to talk about some of the results and why we believe that the survey gives us reason for optimism. And it's optimism that has since been proven to be true. In our surveys, we found that Chinese LSPs experience accurately showed us where the global language industry services industry would end up leading by about 5 months. Now, we asked the companies whether they had seen declines in revenue during and after the period of COVID restrictions. And what we found was that over 2/3 of Chinese LSPs had seen revenue fall during the restrictions, but that number had dropped to just over half in May, with 10% actually experiencing an increase in revenue. And as we'll see, the increase in revenue is significant because it mirrors what we've seen elsewhere since that time. And keep in mind that at this point, the largest LSPs had not yet seen a rebound. They were in the height of pandemic restrictions. And overall, larger international LSPs actually reported more revenue disruption than their Chinese counterparts. In May 2020, when most countries were just starting lockdown measures, the results were quite similar to China's results during the period of restrictions. But even then, Chinese LSPs were experiencing a rebound by April. And the situation had only gotten worse for large LSPs in May. Now, this situation shows that Chinese experience may actually be better than the global one in terms of a quick rebound. But we've since seen that other countries have rebounded as well. The absolute value of these drops in revenue was substantial. Now, the graphic shown on screen illustrates these drops in revenue for top LSPs in May. Although they were concentrated in smaller amounts, the average drop in May was approximately 21% decrease. This was compared to the previous year. And if those factors hadn't changed, it would have been catastrophic for the industry and would have erased several years of solid growth and continual increases throughout the industry. Now, the median change was in the 11 to 20% bracket, which was slightly better than that average, but still severe. But what we saw was that the Chinese rebound predicted that this was unlikely to last, even though many LSP CEOs at this point were really concerned that they were going to have long-term disruptions. And In fact, some LSPs experience catastrophic decreases. Now, based on the Chinese experience, we predicted that within about 5 months from the peak of pandemic conditions, we would see a reversal of this trend. And in fact, what we see, if we compare to December 2020, which represents the fourth quarter, there was a large-scale change. I'll just go back to that slide where you see that only 7% in May were saying an increase, and the bulk were experiencing, again, that about 11 to 30% decrease. Now compare this to December, when 49% were reporting an actual increase in revenue. 8% were reporting no change, and then most of them that experienced the loss were concentrated up at the relatively modest end. So the average revenue change for the year was 4% compared to 2020. Actually, that's an editing error. I meant to say that we again saw this strong increases. Now, what's even more significant, and that I think the Chinese case told us, is that by taking pandemic control measures and trying to focus on controlling supply chain, control costs and other things, what we found is that LSPs, actually many of them globally, as well as in China, have reported that this has actually been record profitable for the year. So we asked the top LSPs how their profitability was for 2020, and 70% of them reported that they had seen stable or increased profitability compared to 2019. Now, the major reasons for this include technology investment, increased demand from specific verticals, and decreases in office costs. So we have to conclude that Chinese LSPs were optimistic, and rightly so, even though when we first surveyed, I have to admit I was somewhat skeptical about what some of the LSPs were telling us. When we asked them what they expected, most Chinese LSPs expected conditions to return to normal by the end of 2020. And just 11% expected that to take longer. Now, I do have to mention that 14% felt it was too soon to tell. And this was at a period when there was still some sense that maybe there would be additional lockdowns or other conditions. But the optimism was highly prescient. Now, compare this back in the same period to what the top LSPs globally were telling us. And these LSPs had entered the conditions later than China and had yet to leave restrictions. But 1 in 5, at that point, 20% felt it was too early to tell. But the less than what we saw was that fewer of them expected conditions to return to normal early on. And the lack of clarity on this was an important issue. It led to a lot of uncertainty. And another factor where we saw a positive change that indicated LSPs were already moving to increase staffing by August 2020. At the height of the pandemic, in China as elsewhere, the immediate response was to freeze hiring, to either hold off on hiring or even, in the case of many companies, to let staff go. But after the restrictions ended, companies started hiring staff, and a quarter of them had started hiring by August, increasing staff. Now, we have to admit some of this may have been rehiring staff that had previously been laid off, but we knew that a lot of it was actually new staff. And this was a good sign that showed where the rest of the world would head. Now, we asked our survey participants how they could have improved their management of business processes or production, and they said that the top issue was that they wished they'd done a better job of training. And this was reflected around the world, where a lot of companies were caught unprepared for the work conditions. And the second biggest concern was an aggregate of financial issues going on at the time. Now, one significant area was that Chinese LSPs found that coming back to the office wasn't easy, and this has played out around the world. Chinese LSPs, however, have tried to bring workers back to the office, and international LSPs have generally not done so. Oh, that's strange. The build came through oddly, but about 1/3 of Chinese LSPs face significant challenges in bringing them back. The nature of work is changing permanently. Based on what top LSPs are telling us, remote work technologies are here to stay. They're not in a hurry to come back. Even after the pandemic ends, overwhelming majorities will maintain the shift to virtual meetings, both for external parties and for internal meetings. Some of the other speakers have talked about the role of Zoom and other technologies in this, and I don't need to add to that. Over half plan to decrease their office space. And this means that offices are at a risk right now of being closed. Of course, for many LSPs, this is a cost-saving measure. And travel, of course, was largely dropped for the same reason we have this meeting virtually. Now, I'd like to note that bringing workers back may not be the right move. LSPs trying to bring workers back in China struggled financially compared to those that have not done so. In this chart, let's see if I've got the build right. It's unfortunately I've lost a graphic, but what we saw was that those companies that had not been bringing workers back in China actually fared considerably better than those that had brought employees back. Another area that Chinese LSPs told us that they felt would have helped us if they'd been more open and more open with employees and clients in communicating with them. At the same time, 14% wish they'd communicated less but been more focused. What these two results tell us is that companies need to avoid oversharing, even if they do communicate more overall. When news changes from day to day or priorities change, it may be better to wait. This, of course, has become less significant, but we saw a lot of LSPs globally running around in something of a panic early on and sharing things that ended up being not the case. So we learned to be a little bit more cautious. Helping employees cope remains important. Employees need logistical and health support even when they're not in the office. And our Council of Enterprise Buyers has told us that their biggest concerns are around helping employees deal with stress and uncertainty, not around profitability or other similar concerns. And as the global pandemic moves into its second year, fatigue and stress remain major concerns. So what are some of the conclusions we have? Well, I think it's obvious that there's light at the end of the tunnel. But some of the recommendations we found that can apply to China elsewhere is that there do need to be changes in work culture. Many of you are familiar with the 996 model, which is the idea that workers come into a centrally managed facility and they work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. And what we found is many Chinese workers found that when they were able to work from home, they preferred it and were actually more productive. And some Chinese LSPs have found that this works better for them. So it may be the case that LSPs need not rush to get back to the old ways, and some of the adjustments may be permanent. Be optimistic. China shows us that things will got better rapidly, and the experience of LSPs since then has followed this. But look to China as a model for where the language industry will go as conditions change. And of course, learn from the past and see what worked for these Chinese companies. And then I think this is almost a trite truism at this point, but be ready for the new remote world. This is going to be permanent. Some other recommendations we have for companies that want to emerge stronger: take advantage of the crisis to re-engineer your processes if you haven't already started doing so. This is what led some companies to really achieve record profitability. Build efficiencies and gather data for machine learning. This is a subject we call small AI. A lot of companies have used downtime or shifts or extra time from not having to travel for conferences to focus on projects that use the data they have and to learn from them. And take advantage of the opportunity to reevaluate your processes, segmentation, and offerings. And just before I go, I'll say that we have data updates from the last year from, as I mentioned, the LSPs in China, the CEOs of the leading LSPs, freelancers, technology vendors and buyers. And a lot of this is provided absolutely free of charge. You can see the URL on the bottom of this slide. So if you're interested in seeing what's there, feel free to look at that. And I'll just close now. I think I'm maybe just about 30 seconds over time by thanking you for your participation. And if you want to reach out to me, feel free to do so with any questions. And with that, I think we can open it for questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a very insightful presentations. Obviously, a lot of data to digest, but I believe all of these are free on the CSA website. So maybe I could pull the website up later and put it on the message box. And actually, Sarah Maria here shared that she's based in Beijing right now, and they are 100% back on site as of June 2020, as well as the other businesses. Well, case here in our side of the planet, the Philippines, we're just approximately 20% of the workforce are back on site. But I do have a question for the LSPs in Chinese. Was there a significant difference between the challenges that interpretation team companies that are more on interpretation versus the companies that are more on written translation? Are there significant challenges or difference in challenges that they faced during the pandemic, post-pandemic?
Yeah, so immediately in the wake of the pandemic, they were hit much harder because so much interpreting work was on site. But one real bright spot, and that actually we see in this conference, has been the real emergence of remote simultaneous interpreting around the world as a growing field. And this was the one area as of about, I want to say July or August, where we've already seen significant growth in the industry was the development of these technologies. And the tools that have developed during that time and the changes have been nothing short of phenomenal. It's gone from a niche function to being mainstream now, and it's really helped some of these companies move forward. Now, of course, conditions are getting a bit better. We're seeing more in-person interpreting opportunities now as government offices and other traditional venues have opened. But this is the segment that's seeing, I think, the greatest long-term shifts in working methods.
We have another question here from Rodrigo. It says, why do you think LSPs in China are more inclined to bring their staff back into the office than their counterparts abroad?
I think it's a cultural difference because, and I don't want to indulge in trite stereotypes at all, but there certainly is more of a sort of a command and control approach that typifies Chinese business, where you have the boss and everybody around and working. Whereas in Western culture, there'd been a longer tradition of remote work, maybe not for everyone, but certainly for the language services industry. So I think it reflects broader just differences in work culture and trends that have developed. And some of it have been that there was greater familiarity with remote work technologies in Western countries earlier on than there had been in China. But that's just speculation for me.
Yep. I think I'll throw in another question here. So how do you expect Chinese LSPs to perform in the long term as compared to in the other parts of the world?
That's a broader question than just about COVID-19, certainly. But with the seemingly insatiable demand from non-Chinese enterprises to go to China, I think the long-term demand is just only going to go up for Chinese LSPs. We currently estimate that there are about 9,000 Chinese LSPs, and by LSPs we mean companies with at least 2 employees, compared to a global population outside of China of around probably something around 16,000. And so it's really, there's a lot of supply, there's a lot of interest in the area, and I think, and the professionalization that's going on in the Chinese LSP industry has just been incredible in the past decade. It's really advanced rapidly, and I think that's just going to continue.